Rarely does history provide a defining moment, a genesis that molds the course of a nation. In the year 1910, the Midwest witnessed an unparalleled confluence of events, shrouded in the dryness of the spring and the threats of immense catalysm. As bolts of lightning streaked the skies and winds gathered momentum, an inevitable force of nature coalesced. A disaster in the making. August 20th and 21st heralded the arrival of the Great Fire, a hurricane of flames that swept across the land, leaving an unforgettable mark and reshaping the very fabric of the nation. The Great Fire of 1910 catalyzed changes in federal fire management policy and settled the dispute between the preservation and conservation movements that centered on the role of the Forest Service.
In the 1890s, prior to the Big Burn, America faced an environmental crisis. Homesteading property languished unused in the rugged West, too far away and dangerous for farmers to go, and completely unprotected by the government. These lands were full of unclaimed sheep that grazed for miles. Entire woods were purchased by corporations. Many believed that within the following 20 years, there would be a lumber famine.
At the time, President Theodore Roosevelt was contributing to the national agenda's inclusion of conservation. He contributed to the preservation of millions of acres of parks, monuments, and national reserves. At the time, the majority of Western senators frequently criticized Roosevelt and publicly opposed the idea of national forests.
Many started to protest because they believed that their land had been taken away from them. For example, before establishing Yellowstone as a national park in 1872, Congress demanded hard evidence that the land could not be used for farming, ranching, or housing. This was just one of the many obstacles that conservationists like Theodore Roosevelt faced in the late 1800s. Regardless, many people embraced the idea of forestry management, and soon education opportunities started to become increasingly more popular. It was not long before forestry students from the East started to venture west to manage some of the newly created national reserves in spirit of taking part in the Great Crusade. One of the primary locations was nestled in the Bitterroot Mountains, Taft, Montana. College graduates were a rare sight to the locals of Taft, Montana, so they took great notice. In the early spring of 1907, a group of rangers, recent graduates of Yale School of Forestry, set foot in the unfamiliar town of Taft. In the West, nothing had prepared them for a place like Taft, Montana, a boisterous, brawling row of gambling parlors, saloons, and brothels. Taft, Montana at the time was described as one of the wickedest places in America.
These rangers had been sent west by the founder of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, who was the first chief of the U.S. Division of Forestry, the first head of the United States Forest Service, and the 28th governor of Pennsylvania. William McKinley appointed Pinchot as the head of Division of Forestry in 1898. He was a hard-driving bureaucrat with a love for the outdoors and a deft hand at politics. Pinchot also formed important relationships with some of the most influential men in the growing conservation movement, including Theodore Roosevelt and some claim famous John Muir. Although Pinchot and Muir didn't always see eye to eye, their differing beliefs underlined and encapsulated the core conflict in America's public land system: preservation versus conservation. Muir advocated preserving nature to be untouched by human influence. In contrast, Pinchot viewed nature as a resource to sustainably use by as many people as possible. Despite their contrasting perspectives, these influential figures did not necessarily become adversaries.
Pinchot had a vision to save the forests of the West from the growing industrial mining facilities, the lengthening railroads that bulldozed their way through the mountains, and the very logging companies his family came from. Pinchot also played an important role in the 1896 National Forest Commission, where they studied American forests and suggested policies for their management. After a 4-month tour of the American West, the commission proposed protecting over 21 million acres of forest across 13 reserves.
Plan 1 is to reserve all such lands at one blow by refusing to allow any forest lands of the United States to be disposed of hereafter. The other course is to secure the reservation of considerable bodies not now reserved, so as to include, as far away as possible, all mountain ranges and any other considerable bodies of government timber land which may exist.
The following years after the 1890s, the General Land Office Rangers, also known as the GLO Rangers, worked to prevent timber theft and illegal grazing on public land. And then on February 1st, 1905, Pinchot centralized federal forest management under the Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Forestry. Political appointments for the GLO forest rangers ceased and was replaced by civil service exams. These new standards encouraged a qualified and more motivated workforce.
The Forest Service was barely 5 years old in the beginning of 1910, and they had yet to come face to face with a big fire. The Forest Service opponents in Congress tried to dismantle the Forest Reserve by cutting off funding for the Forest Service. On top of that, a drought had been going on for around 3 years, but nothing could have prepared the Forest Rangers for the drought that occurred in 1910. There hadn't been a trace of rain since April, and the forest was desiccated. The Forest Service found itself underfunded, understaffed, and in partial disarray. The rangers fresh from elite Eastern universities began to worry about the state of the forest. They had never experienced such drought-stricken land, but not to the older and more experienced Ed Pulowski, who joined the Forest Service in 1908. He had been exploring the West since the ripe age of 16 and mastered many skills along the way.
Late in the evening of July 26, 1910, Ed Pulowski woke to the loud crack of thunder and the violent gusts of wind howling fiercely. The cacophony of nature's fury felt like a foreshadowing of the conflagration to come. Not a single drop of rain dampened the forest floor. Without mercy, the storm unleashed its raw power upon the tranquil forest. Nearly 9 hours later, roughly 1,000 fires set ablaze 22 national forests located in the northern Rockies. They threatened many railroad towns that extended west from Missoula, although Avery and Wallace were at the greatest vulnerability in Idaho.
4,000 soldiers, including 7 companies from the 25th Infantry, also referred to as the Buffalo Soldiers, were dispatched by Taft to the Rockies. They did many things, but firefighting wasn't one of them. Until now.
Another electrical storm caused the number of fires to more than double. Despite the enormous effort from a wide variety of people and everything they had done, they were still worried that the town was going to burn.
By 10:30 a.m. the next day, Wallace was ablaze. Wallace had been burning for 2 hours from forest fires. Stanley A. Easton writes, "Although the wind continues to blow strongly, there is not now as much ashes and O'Hare fragments falling as before. The nearest large fire is not closer than 2.5 hours away." Wallace was inevitably swallowed by flames. The mayor ordered martial law, and chaos erupted. People screaming, kids crying, and stray cats darting through the streets. A plan formed, put the vulnerable on the last train to Spokane, 109 miles away. Meanwhile, the men stayed behind to battle the relentless fire, unaware this train was their sole escape from the inferno. Seven people died in the fire in a mere 36 hours. Parts of 10 national forests were destroyed, and 7 towns located in Montana and Idaho were turned to ashes. While the entire nation was in disbelief and anger, Gifford Pinchot used the natural disaster to criticize the Forest Service's opponents. Pinchot argued that the catastrophe could have been avoided if the Forest Service had received adequate funding and staff. Pinchot's arguments prevailed, and Congress doubled funding for the Forest Service almost overnight. Fire protection under Forest Service leadership became a national crusade. The fire's timing solidified support funding and a mission for the new Forest Service, but it also laid a misdirected course for the fire management that unwittingly set up the country for more extreme wildfires in the future. By the introduction of more effective fire suppression techniques as a result of the increased budget, the Forest Service was able to extinguish fires faster than ever. In 1935, the Forest Service established the 10 a.m. policy, which decreed that every fire should be suppressed by 10 a.m. the day following its initial report. Fire suppression efforts were aided by the development of new technologies such as airplanes, smoke jumpers, medicines, and fire suppression chemicals. With such tools, putting out fires was way easier than before. As a result, the Forest Service was so successful with putting out fires for the next 100 years that it indirectly caused some of the worst fires today. Due to the higher budget, a more systematic approach to fire protection developed. This included building networks of roads, communication systems, lookout towers, and ranger stations. The Big Burn of 1910 was America's largest natural disaster to come to terms with.
But imagine, if the fire had not happened, they might have killed the Forest Service, and with it would have gone the idea that is so embraced by Americans today. We have more than 500 million acres of public lands by saving the idea of conservation.
Hello, tree.
Trees are everybody's friends. Remember, only you can prevent forest fires.